Am I on? There we go. All right, so forward, there we are. Let me start with prayer. Lord, I just thank you so much for this chance that I have to speak here today. Lord, I just pray that you would give me the right words, give me clarity of thought, clarity of speech to share this information about Noah's flood and your creation with the people here, and that it would make a difference in their lives. And I just thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So I'm Frank Moore, and my claim to fame is I graduated from Glide High School in 1965. The largest class at that time to ever graduate from Glide High School. We had 65 students in the class of 65. I wasn't the best student, but I then went on to graduate from Oregon State, go Beavers. And then I finally went to Oregon Health Sciences Center. They used to call it the University of Oregon Medical School. That always grated me because I had no green and yellow blood. So they fortunately changed the name to Oregon Health Sciences Center, which is much better. Not that I'm prejudiced or anything like that. My other claim to fame is that I was the doctor for a lieutenant colonel in the Army by the name of Schwarzkopf. He went on to be famous. I didn't. So today I'm going to be talking about Noah's flood. Actually, before I get on to that, I want to go on a couple of rabbit trails, if that's allowed. Does anybody here know what the one-way speed of light is? If you can prove that, you get a Nobel Prize. Serious. Nobody knows what the one-way speed of light is. It is impossible to measure the one-way speed of light. You can only measure the round-trip speed of light. Einstein, in his relativity theory, was saying, I am assuming that the speed of light is the same in both directions. I absolutely cannot prove it. No one can prove that. And so the speed of light might be infinite coming to you and half the speed of light going away. It is not possible to prove that. There's no way of knowing. So when people say they know all that they know about light, we don't know very much about light. Okay? Another fascinating thing, see if this little, how do I make the little button here? The red. Okay, so if you can see on the back wall there's a little red dot. Now, if I shine this closer to me, is the dot smaller or bigger? What happens to a beam of light as it goes out? Okay, so if you have a flashlight and you shine it here, it's small. If you shine it further, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's because the photons of light are spreading out as they're leaving the light. Well, the same thing happens with the light, the photons coming from the sun. So they start, they start leaving the sun. Basically the diameter of the sun is the amount of where the photons are. And as they go out, the photons get spread further and further and further apart. Does that make sense? When they leave the sun, the sphere of the photons is this diameter of the sun. When you get to the edge of the solar system, let's say, the orbit of Pluto, which I still think is a planet, but anyway, what do I know? But those photons are now the diameter of the orbit of Pluto. If you go out to the nearest star, Alpha Centauri, this wave of photons is now the diameter of the distance to Alpha Centauri. So what's happening to these photons as they go out? They're getting more and more spread out. Does that make sense? So is light a particle or is it a wave? Yes and yes. That's right. The answer is yes and yes. Because there was a very interesting experiment. Anybody here heard of the double slit experiment? Anybody else? So the double slit experiment, some people are so smart, it's just amazing. But if you have a piece of cardboard okay? And you send a beam of light, like a laser, so it's a single point of light going to this piece of cardboard, and it has two slits in it. And if light is a particle, it's going to go there. It's going to go through one slit or the other slit. And so if you have a screen on the back, you will end up seeing, two slits. If light is a particle. However, when you send a beam of light through these two slits, that's not what you get. You actually get a whole series of lines, because light going through that double slit is a wave. And so when waves go through two slits, they interfere with each other, and you get, bigger waves, littler waves, no waves. Does that make sense? Now, the other thing that's all makes sense, right? So light's a wave, right? Now, what happens if you put a detector trying to determine which slot that photon goes through? Suddenly, light becomes a particle, and you only get two slits on the detector behind it. So just the process of looking at the light changes it from a wave to a particle. I mean, how do you explain that? I don't know how you explain it. But the thing is, why that's interesting to me, if you go out at night and you have a clear night where you can see stars, okay, you look up there and there's a star way out there, and you can see the star. And let's say Greg, let's say you're out there with me and we're standing next to each other. And let's say that star, the furthest star that we can see is in the constellation Cassiopeia, and it's 4,000 light years away. And that's about 10 to the 16th miles. So, one with 16 zeros after it, miles. This is a long ways, okay? But let's say we look up there and we see that star. And so I can see this star, and Greg standing next to me can see this star. How can that be? Because if those photons are coming, imagine these photons are going out in this sphere, okay? I mean, by the time you get to be, 10 to the 16th miles away, those photons have to be spread way apart. How can it be so you can be right next to each other and still see the same photon? How can that possibly be? The reason is because light is leaving that star as a wave, and that wave is the size, 10 to the 16th miles in radius, or so 2 times 10 to the 16th miles in diameter. It's gigantic. One photon is just one giant wave. And the amazing thing is when you see that light, that whole wave covering that distance instantly turns to a particle. And you can see it, and because there are all these waves coming, you can see it even if you're standing right next to me. You don't have to jump over, okay, let me get the next proton. Oh, there it is, I see it now. God's ingenuity when creating light is unbelievable. We don't even begin to understand the incredible complexity of life and the beauty of light. Amazing. Now, another rabbit trail. Hold up your hand. Everybody hold up your hand. Just kind of look at your hand. What do you notice about your hand and the fingers? What do you notice about your fingers? Huh? Crooked. Yeah, they're all crooked. But what about they're all different lengths. Why in the world are your fingers different lengths? You ever think about that? Anybody ever think about that? Why don't we just take ourselves for granted, don't we? So watch what happens when I slowly close my hand. What happens? And if you look at your hand, your fingers exactly match the curve of your palm. So everybody's fingers are different lengths, and they just exactly match the curve of your hand. Isn't that amazing? How can that happen by chance? And the other thing that's amazing, and this when I went to medical school, I wasn't a believer, but still God can impact you. When you look at the tendons coming out your hand, coming down the arm, there are 2 tendons that go to each finger. And the tendons are what bend your finger, okay? So when they come down your arm, they're parallel with each other like this, okay? They get into your palm and they rotate, and so one is on top of the other, okay? And so one of the tendons attaches to this bone, and one of the tendons attaches to that bone. So one tendon bends that joint, one tendon bends that joint, okay? Now, which tendon, as you're coming out here, would you expect to be the first one to attach to that first joint? You'd think the bottom one, right? Okay, well, let's say that was the case. And so you have the tendons like this, and they're one laying on top of the other, and you want to bend your finger, and as you start, you want to bend the last joint. What would happen is that top tendon would tend to want to pull out through your skin because you're pulling it down. It needs to have something to anchor it. So what really happens is the top tendon comes out here to this joint, and it forms a tunnel that the bottom tendon goes through to attach out there. Now what happens though if you have a tunnel and that tendon tightens up? What tends to happen? You get that little finger trap thing, right? Well, that's not what happens, because the way this tendon attaches is actually such that when it gets tight, when it pulls tight, it actually loosens that tunnel, the way the fibers attach to that bone. I mean, isn't that, how can that happen by chance? I mean, really, think about that. How can that happen by chance? It can't. So anyway, that's my rabbit trail. Sorry about that. I just throw that in for nothing. So I mean, this is, again, just a summary. I'm not really going into going to be talking about Noah's flood, but this is just something I just want to just share, I think I've shared this before, but just to kind of reiterate it. Evolution is impossible. Evolution statistically is not possible. Life and proteins are too complex to ever have happened by chance. You can't even get one single protein in the history of the universe just to get the protein, the amino acids, just to line up in the right order, much less getting them to join. But just the probability of getting them to line up in the right order for one protein, like hemoglobin has 300 amino acids, could never happen in the universe that's supposedly 16 billion years old. I believe it's 6,000 years old, but it could never happen. And the other thing is evolution has no mechanism. There's nothing that would cause evolution to happen. What do they say causes evolution? Anybody know? Mutations, right? Mutations are random changes to your genetic code, to the nucleic acids that are in the DNA. But if you have a complex code, let's say you have Windows 10, okay, and you want to make it a better one like OS 15, okay, Mac OS 15. Can you make random changes to Windows and turn it into Mac OS? Not going to happen. Well, our DNA is infinitely more complex than the most complex computer code ever designed. So again, if you make random changes, you don't add information, you destroy information. And evolution violates all the known laws of science. Life only comes from life. That's called the biogenic law. No one has ever seen life come from non-life. And what happens when you breed two dogs? What do you get? Has anybody ever seen two dogs create a cat? I mean, it can't happen. Now you can have different kinds of dogs, but you can look at a dog and it's a dog, right? You can ask a 1-year-old, what kind of an animal is this? And they'll tell you it's a dog. Now you give a college graduate and they'll say, well, I don't know what kind of an animal it is. And the other major law of science is the law of entropy. And the law of entropy says that every process, everything that's going on goes in one direction. And that's from order to disorder, okay? Evolution says everything goes from disorder to order, exactly the opposite. Now, you can increase the order of something by putting in energy, but you can't just put in energy into a system. So what happens, I have a pile of lumber out here, and I want to build a house. What happens if I throw a stick of dynamite in there? There's a lot of energy there. What happens? You get more disorder, right? You get disorder faster. To increase the order, you not only have to have energy, but you have to have some kind of an engine, some kind of a machine that changes that energy into useful work to make it, and a blueprint to follow to make it do what you want it to do. Just adding energy doesn't do any good, it makes things worse. And there's no evidence that evolution has ever occurred. There are no transitional fossils. We have billions and billions of fossils. And you can look at a fossil and you can tell by looking at the fossil what kind of an animal it is. You know, you can tell whether it's a reptile, what kind of a reptile. You can tell whether it's a dinosaur, what kind of a dinosaur. There's nothing that's halfway in between. There are no repbirds. There are no fishbians. You know, they're fish or they're amphibians. There's nothing in between. And the other thing is that there are limits to change. Now, you can have change within the dog kind, but you can't get something that's not a dog. So that's just the summary, okay? Sorry, that's also for free. So we're going to talk about Noah's flood and what was Noah's flood like. We're going to talk about, was Noah's flood just a local flood? Because a lot of Christians try to say that Noah's flood was just a local flood in the Mesopotamian river valley. Whereas, again, we'll read the Bible scriptures and it's pretty clear that that couldn't be the case. Where did the water come from? What was the sources of water? Where did the water go? Anybody here know where the water went from the flood? I'm sorry, I can't hear. The water's in the oceans, okay? Now, the thing is interesting, you know, they say there's never been a flood, a global flood, a Noah's flood on the earth, which is 3/4 of the earth is covered with water, okay? But guess what they say formed the surface of Mars? A global flood, and there's not a drop of liquid water on Mars. But Mars was supposedly formed, the structures were formed by a global flood. Get rid of it. Yeah. So, and then what did the flood do? And is there any evidence that there was a flood? So, you know, this is, again, this is a prophecy that has only been fulfilled in the last 150 years. So this 2 Peter 3, 3-6. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers. And what are they going to be doing? Walking after their own lusts and saying, where is the promise of his coming? Has anybody ever heard that? You don't believe Jesus is coming back, do you? Really? Nobody believes that. Okay, that's what they're saying. For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. That's a perfect description of the modern uniformitarian hypothesis. Okay? For this they are willingly ignorant of. Now in the Greek, that means they're dumb on purpose. Okay? That's my interpretation anyway. Okay? They're ignorant, and what are they ignorant of? That by the word of God the heavens were of old, so that God what? Created the heavens and the earth, and that the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world then was being overflowed with water, perished. And what's that talking about? The flood. Okay? So again, the uniformitarian says that the present is the key to the past. The processes that we see going on today are the processes that cause the earth to look like it is. In reality, the past, the flood, is the key to what we see in the present. So instead of the present being the key to the past, it's the past is the key to the present. Now, this is the description of Noah's flood, okay? Genesis 7, 11-12. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, in the 17th day of the month, the same day. So again, this is such an important event that God tells us exactly the day that it happened. Okay, so this is important. But we think that it rained. We think that the flood was caused by rain, but that wasn't it. What was the first thing that happened? All the fountains of the great deep were broken up. And then the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And when it says the windows of heaven were opened, that means it was a deluge of water. The sluice gates of heaven opened, and it torrentially rained like we can't even imagine what it rained like. And the flood was 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth. And the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. That means the waters overwhelmingly overwhelmed the earth. Okay? And all, not some, and all the high hills that were under the whole of heaven were covered. So does that sound like a local flood? Does that sound something local? What happens if you cover the mountains? What does water do? It seeks its own level, so everything is covered, okay? And 15 cubits, or about 23 feet upward, did the waters prevail. Why did the flood need to be 15 cubits over the highest mountain? Anybody know? Because the ark would have drafted about that much, so you had to have that much clearance so that it wouldn't hit anything. Okay? And the mountains were covered, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth. And this is a kind of it's hard to see, but this is a timeline, of the chronology of the flood. And so Noah entered the ark 7 days before the flood. And the other thing is that how did Noah get all of those animals on the ark? How did he get them all? I don't have the scripture on there, but what does it say? God brought the animals to Noah, okay? And he brought them 2 by 2, except for the clean animals, which were 7s. So how did Noah take care of all those animals? First of all, the ark was bigger than we can. Anybody here been to the Ark Museum? And it's unbelievable how big that boat was. Okay, unbelievable. But the rabbits went on 2 by 2, and how did they come off? Huh? They came off 2 by 2. How about the mice? So what happened? How did that happen? I think they hibernated. So but anyway, I'm getting all these rains. So the rain. So 7 days after Noah entered the ark, the rain started. The rain stopped on day 40. But the water continued to rise until day 150. And I believe that, we'll talk about that, but I believe that was because the water under the firmament was still coming out, but it was covered so it could no longer shoot up into the air as rain. And so the ark rested on the Ararat Mount on day 150. Then the water started to recede on day 150, and it took another over 150 days for the waters to drain off the earth. And so the total duration of the flood was 370 days, and the total time spent on the ark was 377 days, okay? Now, what was the flood like? I had this picture, in my mind when I first became Christian. The Noah's flood was just this, it rained and the water came up and covered everything and then went back down. Is that what a flood does? No. The flood was the most destructive event ever in the history of the world. And it was a worldwide flood. Mountain covering, life destroying. Probably it rained 2,000 feet in 40 days. Okay? Can we even imagine that? Probably half the water in today's ocean came as rain in 40 days. And a massive flood is the most destructive natural force known. Perhaps an atomic blast might be more destructive, but it's hard to imagine anything more destructive than a worldwide flood. Now, does anybody remember this? Okay. This was taken by a classmate of mine, Jim Scherstedt. And this was actually before the water hit its peak, because you see the signs not covered. When was this? Anybody know this? 64. Yeah, 64. When the flood hit its peak, that sign was actually underwater, okay? So in the 64 flood, it rained about 15 inches, okay, over a few days. Try to imagine 2,000 feet of rain, okay? So here's the Lone Rock Bridge, okay? And this is before it got to the peak. Okay, this is the Narrows looking up at Mack's Place. Okay? We actually at Steamboat, I almost got stuck at Steamboat by myself, except for the people that were getting trapped with me, so I'd have been running Steamboat in by myself. My dad and mom and Denny and Linda and Colleen were actually going to Roseburg for something, I don't know what, and Dad got to the Frontier store, and he kind of looked over, and he could look up kind of at the water going by, and he said, I don't like the looks of this, we're turning around. And 30 minutes after he got back to Steamboat, the water flooded over the road at Williams Creek. Okay, so if he'd have gotten in 30 minutes later, I'd have been there by myself. So that's the 64 flood, 15 inches of rain, not a bad flood, right? Okay, so was the flood local? Okay, if you had a local flood that covered the mountaintops, could it possibly look like this? Huh? I mean, it's absurd, isn't it? Okay, so the flood couldn't have been local because water seeks its own level. Okay, and before the flood, you say, well, how could possibly the flood have covered Mount Everest? Well, that's simple, because Mount Everest didn't exist. Okay, before the flood, the mountains were much lower. Probably the highest mountains before the flood were 3, 4, maybe 5,000 feet high. They were just probably more likely hills, not actually steep mountains. And if the mountains were covered, the rest of the earth had to have been covered. Okay? And then if it was a local flood, why in the world would God have Noah spend 100 years building an ark? And why did he get the birds on the ark? I mean, he could have just told, the animals could have just migrated. If he brought them to Noah, he could have had them go somewhere else. It makes no sense. So then there's the Rainbow Covenant, okay? And so it talks about, you can read the Rainbow Covenant there, but at the very end it says, and the water shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. Now, have there been any local floods since Noah's flood? Yeah, so if that's the case, if it was only a local flood, then God lied. Because there have been many, many local floods. Many people have been killed by floods. Okay? So where did the waters come from? So the first thing that happened is that the fountains of the great deep broke open, and we'll show a little bit, we'll talk about that. Then the other thing, there were massive tsunamis or tidal waves. Now, in 1964, we had an earthquake in Alaska, and there was about, 15, 20 feet of earth movement, I believe. And what was it that damaged and destroyed Alaska? Was it the earthquake? It was the tsunami that destroyed all the coastal towns. There were people in Crescent City that were killed by the tidal wave of the 64 earthquake. And then the 2011 Japanese earthquake. Again, what was it that did the most destruction? It wasn't the earthquake. It was the massive tidal wave that came in and destroyed it. Now, in the Grand Canyon, that was 15 or 20 feet of earth movement. In the Grand Canyon, there are earthquake faults of 3 miles. What would a 3-mile earthquake cause if that happened underwater? I mean, you can't even imagine what kind of a tidal wave. Now, the interesting thing about tidal waves, if you're in the middle of the ocean, do you even know that a tidal wave is going by? Huh? Not much. So you only a huge tidal wave is only like maybe 2 or 3 feet high and is long. A tidal wave is like 1,000 miles long. Okay? And the reason that when it causes destruction is when all that water hits ground, and then it piles up and it builds up, and that's what causes the damage. So Noah's Ark in the middle of the ocean of the flood wouldn't even know that something went by. Okay. So now this is a kind of a schematic of what maybe the pre-flood earth might have been like. So you have in the middle there is you have the firmament or the crust of the earth. Walt Brown is the person that developed the theory called the hydroplate theory that I think best explained things. But he says, so the crust of the earth was probably, the granite crust was probably about 60 miles thick. And then under this was about half the water that's in today's ocean. And then you had the basement rocks underneath that. Does anybody here know what I think I've quizzed you on this before, but what's the longest mountain range in the world? It's underwater, that's true. Anybody know what it's called? The Mid-Ocean Ridge. The Mid-Ocean Ridge. And it's 44,000 miles long. It goes around the entire Earth. Okay? And a couple of interesting things about this schematic that show this is a picture of the Earth, what the ocean bottoms look like. If the water in the ocean was 500 feet lower, you could walk anywhere on the Earth from place to place, because it would be the only place where there is a little deeper is there's a small area just on the west side of Greenland where it's deeper, where you could probably even see across it if you wanted to go across. But you could walk easily from Asia to Alaska. You could walk to Australia. Now, the other thing is kind of hard to see in this picture I'm closer, so you can, right about here is the Galapagos Islands. And so again, if the water were 500 feet lower, the animals could just walk, or they could crawl, do whatever they wanted to get to the Galapagos Islands. And the other thing that's fascinating is right here is the mid-oceanic ridge tees into itself. And it's felt that most likely the split, I'll go into that, began someplace up in here and went this direction and is going in both directions. It came this way, and this is where the two ends of the split we'll talk about, the rupture, joined each other, is right there in the Indian Ocean. Now, the thing that you see here also, the mountain ranges, how do the mountain ranges tend to run on the continents? North-south, which is parallel to the coastline, right? Okay, we'll explain that. Now, the only place that the Himalayas are not. The Himalayas are kind of they're opposite. They're 90 degrees to the rest of them. The reason for that is that India is a separate plate, and I will describe these plates. But so we'll talk about this whole area of Asia and Africa is moving to the east. India comes up and is coming from the south, and they collide with each other. And they're probably going 50 to 100 miles an hour when they collide. We'll talk about that a little bit. So just imagine the force, when that happens. That's why the Himalayas are so high, is because you have two of these things going with each other, against each other. So I can't read that so far back. Okay, so I talk about the 500 feet and then the T that's in the... Now, anybody seen this schematic, this drawing before? Anybody seen this? Okay, so the Bible actually talks about how all the land was in one place. He put the land in one place and the water in one place. So there probably was, at one point in time, a single continent, okay? But are there any problems with this particular picture that's in every textbook? Well, the problem is that Africa has been shrunk by 35%. Where's Central America and Mexico? They're not there, are they? Europe is rotated counterclockwise. Africa is rotated clockwise, just to try to make those things fit. And Asia's gone. But actually, if you fit the continents and the continental shelves against the mid-oceanic ridge, the mid-Atlantic ridge, they actually fit well. Only thing is, there is a lot of material missing. And so the continents were connected, but something happened to that rock. What happened to all that rock? Okay, well, that rock got blown out and spread out all over the earth, the sedimentary layers, and we'll talk about actually the water coming out from underneath that crust 60 miles deep under all this pressure, and it's heated. It's what they call supercritical water. That water is coming out of that crack hypersonically, probably coming out 20 to 50 miles per second, okay, faster than the escape velocity from the Earth. And so it's actually blasting stuff into space, and that's where the comets come from, that's where the asteroids come from, that's where meteoroids come from. They come from the Earth. Now, when we look at the moon, I don't know if we'll get there. So if I don't say it, I may forget it. So if you look at the moon, the side toward the Earth is pummeled with craters. There are craters everywhere on the near side of the Earth. Nowhere near as many on the far side of the moon. I said the moon, the near side of the moon, the far side of the moon. And the reason is because that's the side that was getting blasted by all this getting blown up into the space from Earth. And that's why comets are coming back, some of them to visit us, because they came from here and they're returning home. Okay? And when you look at a comet, what is a comet made of? Mud and ice. Okay? And interestingly, I think it's olivine, I think, is something that's made deep in the earth. Denny's my expert here. But they actually find olivine, and olivine has to be, as I understand, it actually needs to have water somehow with it. Huh? Yeah. So, for a comet to have olivine, it had to have been under pressure, and it had to have water with it. And so comets have olivine, which came from deep in the earth. So the flood, Noah's flood actually has kind of four phases. We'll talk about these phases. We have the rupture phase, which is the first phase, and that probably lasted about 3 hours. That's when this split, this rupture occurred in the Earth's crust. Then there's the flood phase that lasted for several months. Then the continental drift phase, we'll talk about that lasted probably a day or two. Then the recovery phase is the phase that's still going on today. The Earth is still settling back from the effects of the flood. And again, I believe part of the recovery phase is the Ice Age. Now, there was an Ice Age. What caused it? How can you get an Ice Age? Most of you think, well, you just got to get cold. No, that's not. What happens when you get cold? The humidity is down. You don't get hardly any precipitation. The driest deserts in the world, some of them are cold. The North Slope of Alaska, Antarctica, these places, they're cold. They don't get a huge amount of snowfall. So to get an ice age, you have to have warm oceans, cold continents, and after the flood, the oceans were probably very likely heated up 80 to 90 degrees all over the world. And so you have 90-degree oceans up in the north, and you have all these volcanoes going, blocking light coming in. The earth gets cold, lots of evaporation. You probably had snowstorms with hundreds of feet of snow in a single storm. And it's going on for years. And that's where all the glaciers and everything came from. I'm getting distracted here. So again, the rupture phase started when the earth, the fountains of the great deep broken up, and you get the rain from these fountains going up into the air, spreading out over, and then coming back down as rain. And that's when the windows of heavens were opened and the comets and stuff. We talked about that. So this is kind of a schematic of what it might have looked like. You have this crack in the earth and the water coming down from 60 miles below, blasting up into the atmosphere, into space, spreading out as rain. And so the water under the earth, so it had been there for about 1,500 years, the water under the firmament, which are the fountains of the great deep. And as the moon is going around, it actually tends to lift up the crust of the earth a little bit. And so you have this, what's called tidal pumping. And the tidal pumping would tend to increase the temperature, in this water under the 60 miles of the crust. And it becomes what they call supercritical. And now I'm not a physicist, but supercritical water is we all know about water being solid, liquid, and a gas. Supercritical water is when you get above a certain temperature and a certain pressure, it actually kind of becomes a mixture of gas and liquid, and it dissolves things much better. That's kind of how they make decaf coffee some ways, is they use supercritical fluids to get the caffeine out of the coffee beans, because it dissolves things so well. So this water would have been super saturated with different elements, and it's also very slippery. It's got a much lower coefficient of friction even than water. But so this supercritical water would have been blasting out of there, expanding, and it accelerates. So it's super hot down in the earth. One of the things they say is, well, it would be so hot it would boil the oceans. Well, what happens if you expand a gas? What does it do? Anybody remember high school physics? If you compress a gas, what happens to it? It gets hot. If you expand a gas, it gets cold. So the same thing if you're putting propane into a propane tank and it overfills and comes blasting out, is it hot or cold? And you can get frostbite from that because it's expanding and it's so cold, right? So the same thing with supercritical water. By the time, so it's 60 miles deep, it's coming out of there, it's expanding and accelerating like crazy. It would have cooled, it would no longer have been hot. Now, this water is coming out of there 10 to 20 miles per second. So it won't, from the depth down there to getting into the atmosphere would only take 10 seconds maybe for that water to get out of that depth. That's how fast it's going. It's hard to imagine, but so the rupture began as this crack, a microscopic crack, between Alaska and Siberia. And this crack would have been under so much pressure, it would spread both directions at the speed of sound in rock, which is about 3 miles per second. Okay, so that's going about 10,000 miles per hour. In a matter of 2 to 3 hours, it completely circumvents the whole Earth. And that's where you get that mid-oceanic ridge. So again, this is just kind of another schematic of that same thing, of the mid-oceanic ridge. And somewhere between 2 and 4 billion cubic miles of material is blown out of this crack and out of the sediments underneath the crust of the Earth. Some of that stuff went up the moon and caused the craters. A lot of it is formed sediment that's deposited all over the Earth. Now, so that's the rupture phase. The flood phase lasted several months. And so the flood phase is as the water is coming out now from the fountains of the great deep, filling up. After 40 days, the water is deep enough that it prevents this water from continuing to blast out into space. It's still coming out, but not going up into space. So it's no longer raining. It's just still coming up. And during the flood phase, you probably doubled the amount of water in the ocean. Okay? And that's what formed the fossils. You have this tremendous sediment being formed all over, and that's how the fossils get formed. That's where the sedimentary layers come from. And there's something called the Z-pinch, and as these rocks are hitting each other, you actually can change the elements into different elements. And that's probably, I don't believe there was radioactivity before the flood, because when God created the earth, it was very good. And is radioactivity good? It causes cancer. So I can't say that for sure. The Bible doesn't say that absolutely, but I think there probably was not radioactivity before the flood. And if the flood happened the way the Bible describes the flood happening, what would the evidence be? What would you expect to find? Well, you would expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. That's what you'd expect to find. So, what do we find? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. I mean, just exactly what Noah's flood said we should find. That's what we find. Now, look at these following pictures. I have some pictures of fossils, and just try to imagine if these can happen slowly and gradually over eons of time. Because what they say is, let's say a fish dies, sinks to the bottom of the water, gets covered by sediment, and turns into a fossil. Well, does that make sense? What happens to a fish when it dies? Huh? It kind of floats, doesn't it? Yeah. Does it sink to the bottom and get covered by sediment? I mean, and if it does sink, what happens to it? Things eat it up, right? I mean, it's gone in days at the most. Can it stay down there for thousands of years while it's getting covered with sediment? Absurd. Okay, so here's a picture of a fossil of a bacteria in the process of division. How long does that take? Minutes, okay? Look at all the other pictures, just multiple bacteria. What happens to a bacteria when it dies? Water seeps in and it bursts. How long does that take? Seconds. Okay, so to fossilize bacteria, something drastic had to have happened rapidly. Now here's a good one. This is a picture of a fish eating a fishin, another fish. Now the only way you can get a fossil like this is if you have an aquarium and you see a fish eating another fish and you just dump a load of cement in there. Okay, so something happened. This fish was merely going on its way eating this other fish, and suddenly, whap, it gets covered by cement. By these sediments. Now these are trilobites. These are supposedly some of the oldest animals that lived on the earth. Look at these things. The detail in these things, it's amazing. These are kind of like a pill bug. They can kind of roll up kind of like a pill bug. These things were just happily going on their way, living their life, and zap, they get suddenly buried and turn into fossils. I love this one. Here's a little fish on a palm frond. Now, again, can that fish just have died and fallen down there on the palm frond and get covered by sediments and turn into a fossil? Absurd. And when you look at these fish fossils, you look at this fossil, you get up close, you can see the eyes. You can actually see scales on a lot of these things. You can see the skin where it goes around the tail. The detail in these things, and you see what's in their stomach, some of them. It's amazing, the detail. This is one of my favorite kinds. This is called a polystratic fossil. I'm running out of time. There's thousands and thousands and millions of these kind of fossils. This is an upright tree standing up through about 40 feet of sediment. So and you think about that. So I have this tree and I want to turn it into a fossil, but it takes thousands of years to form 3 or 4 inches of sediment. How can that tree stand upright for thousands and thousands and thousands of years and get covered by sediment and turn into a fossil? It can't happen. Now this is kind of hard to see, but this is called a nautiloid. Right here, see this circle? Can you see that circle right there? A nautiloid is kind of like a squid in a shell. And these nautiloids, this is in the Grand Canyon, the red wall limestone of the Grand Canyon. And these nautiloids, some of them are 6 feet long. The first trip that I took to the Grand Canyon with my oldest daughter, Brianna, there's a canyon called Nautiloid Canyon where they knew that they had these fossil nautiloids. And we actually went with the Institute of Creation Research And we actually measured these fossils with a compass to see what their orientation was. And supposedly these things died, sunk to the bottom, and got covered by sediment. If that happened, you would expect the fossils to be in a random pointing in all random directions. Well, they're not. They're all pointing in a northwest, southeast direction. So they're laid down by a current. Now, not only, then we start looking closer, not only do we see these fossils, nautiloids that are laying this way, this fossil nautiloid is laying vertically. Okay? So this is a 6-foot long squid with a shell around it, standing vertically in red wall limestone. The limestone supposedly takes, 1,000 years to get an inch of limestone. So how are you going to bury a 6-foot nautiloid over millions of years? It can't happen. It's absurd. So the continental drift phase, this is where we're going to, I better get going. I'm not going fast enough. So the continental drift phase is you have the continents, and this is what the Bible talks about, where the water went after the flood. So thou hast covered it with the deep as with a vesture. The waters stood above the mountains. So that's the flood. At thy rebuke they fled. So the waters are fleeing away. At the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. The mountains rose. The valleys sank into the place which they have, thou hast founded for them. So at the end, how the flood ended. The mountains rose, the valley sank, and the waters hasted away and ran off the continents. And that probably lasted a day. It probably occurred on about day 150. And that's what created the mountain ranges, the ocean ridges, the volcanoes, massive lava flows, and that sort of thing. So this is a diagram kind of what it may have looked like. So I went the wrong way. So you have the continent, the crust down the bottom. You have the fountains of the great deep. You have the granite crust. You get the crack. This doesn't show the water, but the water is then blasting out of this crack, tearing that crack, widening and wider and wider and wider and wider. And eventually, like if you have a water bed and you push on the two sides of the water bed, what happens to the middle? Kind of bows up, right? Well, the same thing happens on the earth. As this crack gets wide enough, the firmament is pushing down. There's nothing in the middle, and so the rocks underneath bow up. Okay, so now you have these continental plates. So here you have the bows up. You have these are the pictures of these are the continental plates. Right, I'm not showing it very well. Right there, you have the continental plates, the mid-Atlantic ridge bows up and starts widening that gap. And eventually this bows up, you get the mid-Atlantic ridge, and now you have North America and Europe on this ridge, bows up 10 miles, okay? And it's on supercritical water, it has essentially no friction. What's going to happen to those continental plates? They're going to slide down. And so these plates start sliding, who knows, 50 to 100 miles an hour. Can you imagine North America going to the west, 50 to 100, the whole thing going to the west, 50 miles, 100 miles an hour? And then what happens when it comes to a stop? Because what happens to America, North America and South America, they actually run in to the mid-Pacific ridge. So they hit this mountain range that's in the middle of the Pacific. And what's going to happen? It's a collision. So the front of it stops, the back keeps going, you compress. What's going to happen? You're going to get mountains. That's why are the mountains all parallel to the coast? Because they hit the mid-Pacific ridge and bam, they're going to become your mountains. Okay? So, and just, again, it talked about, in the scripture, it talked about the voice of thy thunder. The waters hasted away. Can you imagine the sound when North America hits the mid-Pacific plate? I mean, there's going to be thunder, right? Okay? Now, is there any evidence about what a flood would do? Anybody heard of the Lake Missoula flood? Okay? So Lake Missoula was a glacial lake about 4,000 years ago toward the end of the Ice Age. It was about 4,000 feet in elevation. At the deepest point in western Montana, it was about 2,000 feet deep, this lake. It was 1,000 feet deep over Missoula, Montana. It held 5 times the amount of water that's in Lake Erie. More water than in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. Okay, and it was an ice dam. Okay? This lake drained in 48 hours. All of that water came whooshing down the Columbia River in 48 hours. And that's 10 times the flow of all the rivers in all the world combined. Okay? That's a lot of water. And that water is moving 60 to 100 miles an hour with 600 feet deep going over Spokane, Washington, 400 feet deep when it got to Portland. It eroded 50 cubic miles of water, and when it comes down, it gets to Portland and gets to the narrowing area just to the west of Portland. Suddenly it all dams up, the water backs up into the Willamette Valley, drops all the sediment, and that's where the Willamette Valley is. We got to, Willamette Valley people need to thank the people in eastern Washington for giving them all the dirt. Okay, and initially you have this water coming out of Lake Missoula as a massive, wide plain of flood that planes everything off, and then it's like if you go to the ocean and you see a wave come in. The wave comes in as this sheet, starts going out of the sheet, but then it starts kind of narrowing, and everybody has seen that. You get little rivulets that form and little miniature canyons form as the wave goes out. Well, the same thing happens here. Initially, it's just this giant flat wave, starts to form little currents, gets into little things, and then you start eroding different canyons. The channels flow carved real deep canyons like Grand Coulee, which is 50 miles long, 60 miles wide, 900 feet deep. Palouse Canyon will show you some pictures of these. So these pictures I'm going to show you formed in less than a week. So here's Steamboat Rock, eastern Washington. It's 900 feet high. All that land around Steamboat Rock was eroded away. It used to be there, but it's gone, eroded away in 2 or 3 days. This is Grand Coulee. Again, all of that area used to have that sediment on it, like it's on top of that center part there. All that used to be there, and that got washed away by the Missoula flood. This is Moses Coulee. It's 30 miles long, 500 feet deep. Again, formed in 2 or 3 days. This is called Dry Falls. Has anybody been there to the Dry Falls? I've never been there. I've heard of it. 400 feet high. 3.5 miles long. This would have been the world's greatest waterfall at the time this was happening. I mean, just the water was 400 feet deep going over the top of that. This is the Palouse Canyon. Has anybody ever been to the Palouse Canyon? So again, this canyon, 400, 600 feet deep, vertical walls, 12 miles long, formed in 2 or 3 days. And then the Willamette Valley. Again, we've all seen the Willamette Valley, flat as a pancake in most places. The dirt, the soil there, I think it's a couple hundred feet deep. Thank you, eastern Washington. Okay. So, if evolution is true, you got to ask yourself questions. So what is the importance of all this? So who am I? Okay, if evolution is true, if we've been around for billions of years, got here by evolution, then I'm just an animal with higher intelligence. However, if the Bible is true, if creation is true, I'm made in the image of God, and I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Okay? So what happens when I die? If evolution is true, I came from an ape, I died, go into the ground, get eaten by worms, and that's the end of it. But if we're created by God, it depends on your relationship with Jesus Christ. And so what? So atheism and agnosticism are scientifically impossible. Cannot possibly be true. Mankind has rebelled against the Creator, and God the Creator loves us, and He died for us. John 1:3. Now, this is a trick question that I like to ask in some of my talks as well. What is the first miracle of Jesus recorded in the Bible? That's what everybody says, but that's not the first miracle. This is the first miracle recorded in the Bible about Jesus, of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So that's the first miracle of Jesus recorded in the Bible. You don't think about that, right? You kind of go over that. You don't think about that, right? And John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not be perished but should be saved. Okay, so you need to have Jesus as your Savior. If you don't know Jesus as your Savior, there is a place that you're going to, and it's not to be with God forever. It's called hell. And you don't want to go there. Okay? I talked too long again. Any questions? Does anybody have any questions? If you can talk to me afterwards, but sometimes asking questions in front of everybody, people have the same question, and it helps to answer if anybody has any questions. I know I went really fast. No questions. Good, I must have done a good job. All right. Thank you for letting me talk and share here today. I appreciate that very much.
There we go. Hello.